Would you mind if you could just give us I know the story of Impossible to Imagine. I've seen the film, but in your own words, if you could just give us a quick synopsis about it, that'd be great.
So it's the story of a traditional Kyoto woman who's running a traditional Kyoto shop that's a kimono shop, and it's not doing very well.
Yeah.
And she brings in a consultant, and he's bicultural. He's Japanese and Australian. And he's a kind of person who likes things to move fast, to change quickly. And so, of course, they clash. They have very different perspectives. But they get to know each other a bit better, and they fall in love. But that differing worldview continues to be a point of issue for them, and the question of the film is, can they change enough to make it work? Can they change enough for each other? Brilliant.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I really love the way this film shot. I know you were cinematographer, the editor, director, writer on this. Everything. And because I'm quite interested to talk to you about Matcha and Vanilla, which I know is your next film, which I don't think has been released yet, but if we can obviously mainly about this. So where does the idea come? No, actually, can we roll back from that? I'm actually quite fascinated to know why you moved from Australia to Japan. So, was it 14 years ago?
Yeah, well, it was my life goal. That's all I wanted to do, was to live in Japan. I started learning Japanese in my school at 10 years old. They used to teach Japanese in Australian schools.
Yeah.
And I fell in love with the country, and I had really good teachers who were Australian, but they'd lived in Japan.
Yeah.
And they just painted this picture for me of this completely different country, completely different culture, and I just wanted to go so badly. And then I was lucky enough to get recruited as an English conversation teacher, and that was going to be a year, and then I loved it, and it was going to be 2 years, and then 14 years later,
you stayed. It's quite interesting because in your accent, I can hear that how your voice is losing its Australian, if that kind of makes sense. I can hear it, but it's definitely a change. I'm assuming other people have said this to you, but obviously you're losing it a little bit. So where did the idea for this come from? Is it because I assume it's all from you? It must be you're the writer. So how did this all come about?
A few different strands. So because I live in Japan and my husband is Japanese, one of the things that we're thinking about is having a family.
Right.
And that experience of bicultural children in Japan is one that I've seen before my eyes as a teacher. I'm a primary school teacher.
Right.
So having children who have a parent who's Canadian, for example, and another parent who's Japanese, but then they're in an international school and they identify very strongly with being Canadian, but they've never lived there. This mixed identity, this confusion, it lasts from childhood all the way through adulthood, and it's something that if you're in a Japanese school, you have, of course, instances of bullying and things like that. So I was very worried about it. So that was one thing. And like living here in Japan, I'm very invested in the country and the society, so I'm wondering where it will go in the next 10 to 15 years and how it will change, or will it change? Japanese society has been quite static in many ways for the last 20 to 30 years. But in other instances, Japan has changed hugely. Like if you look at historical periods of change in Japan post-World War II, the Meiji era, when the American ships came in and opened up with trade with Japan, huge changes. So I'm really curious as to the future, and now the coronavirus has thrown another thing into the mix.
Oh God!
It makes me even more interested how Japan's going to change.
And how have you? Let's take the last 14 or 15 years, because obviously you've lived through now. And what have you seen aggressively change or massively change in that time period that you can kind of put your finger on?
Probably the familiarity and comfort with foreigners has been a big change. When I first got here, foreigners were still reasonably rare, and I would see another foreigner on the train platform and we'd kind of look at each other and kind of give each other a nod of recognition.
Right.
And when I was in a different part of Japan, sometimes kids would stare, and I always found it super cute. They kind of like follow you with their eyes. People would want to speak English to you. They kind of get excited, try to practice English with you. And over the last 5 to 6 years, there was a huge explosion of tourism, massive.
Right. Yeah.
And you can look at the numbers. Like in 2003, Japan had like less than 2 million or something foreign visitors, and now they're trying to hit 40 million a year.
Blimey.
Before COVID. And people hardly look twice at a foreigner now, and there's a lot of just maybe comfort and familiarity, I suppose. That's probably the biggest change that I've noticed. It's
interesting you say that. I mean, I went to Chicago about 4 or 5 years ago, and I've been to America before, but I hadn't been for a number of years. And I remember when I was in the States previously in the early 90s, it was still, you had a lot of people chatting to you because you were English. But I noticed when I went to Chicago, we went up along to Indianapolis. I didn't get that one. I did once, and I just suppose it's not that I'm particularly bothered, but it was interesting to notice how things have changed and moved so much in terms of, because everyone's goes everywhere, and the world has become much more multicultural and much more intertwined. I mean, the fact that we're talking very easily over a digital platform now, which you couldn't do that many years ago, and I think it has made people, it's become, I suppose what I'm trying to say about it is people's accents and their background is less of a wow factor than it once was, because we're just all part of the, it has shrunk, and I think that, more familiarity. Something that was quite interesting, I was reading the background to this film, which intrigued me, was you said one of the themes you wanted to explore was depopulation. And I'm guessing, does that mean that the birth rate in Japan has lowered somewhat?
Oh, yeah, hugely. Some Japanese economists called it the coffin shape, I think, because the inverted pyramid.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he's really dark with his analysis, because it is, I can't tell you the exact amount at the moment, but there's even now there's quite a large percentage of people over the age of 65.
Right.
And by 2050, it'll be something like 30 or 40% of the population will be over 65. So that's huge. And that means that the working population is supporting pensions, because Japan is a very socially progressive in many ways society, so it does have a good pension, it's got good medical for everyone, but all of that money comes from tax.
Yeah, of course.
So there's very few young people, and depopulation is most apparent when you go out of the cities and you go to the villages, and they're beautiful and they're idyllic and they're rural, but no one's living there anymore. They're completely empty, and it's such a shame. These very old settlements, and just no one's living there anymore.
And I guess it's the same in the UK, although the population's increased. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that there's people. It's not a problem, but it's a situation. People are living longer, and there's less tax receipts coming in, and it's the same kind of thing. And of course, to add insult to injury, which has happened globally, touched on it earlier, is bloody COVID, of course. And I don't know the situation in Japan. In the UK, it's pretty grim. I mean, we're facing another kind of national lockdown. Wave 2 is here, which we kind of all predicted anyway. So what's the story where you are?
Japan seems to be avoiding the worst so far. We closed the schools for 2 or 3 months in the April, May, early June period. So my international school was closed, and all the schools in Japan were closed.
Right.
But that wave was a lot smaller than the second wave, which was much bigger, but it had less hospitalizations and it seemed to have less of a death rate. But the amount of cases was much higher. And so we've come down from that again. And the second wave, even though it was much bigger, because it has such a low mortality and it had such low hospitalization, there wasn't much impact except on like nightlife. They closed a lot of nightclubs and and stuff like that. Yeah.
So did I read this right, that your background is actually, you were involved in documentary filmmaking before you got involved in narrative features? So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so My background in filmmaking is very much self-taught, and I went through the YouTube school, I suppose, of making little travel videos, and then I graduated from that into making longer documentaries, again, ones for YouTube, where I interviewed people about being third culture kids in Japan, or, changing their citizenship to Japanese, citizenship from American or Indonesian, so kind of a similar theme. And then I've always been more interested in writing narratives. I love to write myself. I write stories all the time. So I guess it was natural that I was taking the experiences that I'd had from documentary making and all of these interviews that I'd done and kind of putting that into the film as well.
Don't worry, I use YouTube to teach myself to fly a drone and get all the things and use it as I shoot. No, so I find it a fabulous tool. What I'm really interested in was, because a lot of the imagery in this film is not static, that's the wrong word, but it's very intimate in terms of often it's the couple. So, and it looks ravishing, by the way, it's really filmed well, and I know you cinematography on it, but how do you make it eye candy? How do you give it that kind of eye? Because you've got to try and make the shot look interesting, even when there's just a couple of people. And I know a lot of that is to do with the background and the setting, and I get that, because I'd imagine Japan, by its very nature, looks gorgeous most of the time anyway. But even so, you've got to try and give it a kind of look to it, haven't you? To try and make it stand. I mean, how do you go about doing that?
Definitely the locations were a huge part of it. Getting the tea house as the main location, and knowing a lot of places like Horikawa River, which is the river that they walk along, the bridge in the background. A lot of the places were really close to school, so that helped. And then Uji at the end, where they're standing at the river in the background. We woke up really early in the morning to get golden hour.
Lovely.
We knew that would be really beautiful. But I haven't got much experience with lighting yet, so I really relied a lot on natural light. So hopefully that's had a good kind of presented a kind of a nice, soft picture. I storyboard a lot before we shot, so I would really have a strong idea of what the scene would look like.
Yeah. I think that's a great thing. I mean, there's a really, you probably know this story anyway, it's quite famous, where Ridley Scott was asked to be the director of Alien, and I think at the time the budget was, I might be wrong here, but I think it was $4 million. And on the strength of his storyboarding, when he said, I'll do the gig, they doubled the budget, and that was just because he was, by his very nature, he's a really brilliant artist anyway. Mm-hmm. So it just shows you how strongly things can change just by doing that. And I think also, I mean, look, I don't know the ins and outs of filmmaking. Obviously, we run the festivals, but it's very interesting when you talk to people about storyboarding, and most of them do it. And I always wonder when they don't do it if they're kind of flying by the seats of their pants. So and of course you're going to save time, you're going to save money because you can then angle the shots and all that. But then again, I suppose you can do so much in post now. I understand that, but even so, I think storyboarding has got to be almost like a given, really. I would suggest. It makes sense to me.
Totally. The director, whose name escapes me at the moment, of Fury Road in the Mad Max series.
Oh, George.
Fury Road.
Yeah, the Australian George. I can't remember his surname. It's him anyway, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
We've done the original. Yeah.
Fury Road has so little in the way of script. So it's basically, there's a great YouTube video on this. It's basically storyboards, and these gorgeous storyboards. Like they get a professional artist in, and then that's how they kind of set up all those incredible shots with that film, because it's basically all action and visual, right?
It is,
Road.
Yeah, it is. And the dialogue's really sparse, and actually, because I've obviously seen it loads of times, but I always remember the opening sequence where he's urinating and gets into the car and drives off. But that sequence where they're chasing is just amazing. And of course, the colours, I mean, I imagine a lot of that was done in post to give that really rich look. But even so, it was just amazing to look at. And you're right, it's really sparse. The dialogue is really kind of non-existent. Not non-existent, but there's very little in it. And it's all done, with the in action sequence, and it does. It's a bloody brilliant film. There's no getting away from it. It's a staggering film to watch.
It's one of my favourites. Colour, though, that was a big part. Like, I'm not a colourist, so I had a friend who wanted to become more of a professional colorist, and so he took it on.
Yeah.
So that was a really interesting experience as well. We would send clips back and forth, and he would say, "What are you looking for here? What's the feeling?" So, for example, there's an intimate scene, and when it was shot, we shot it with a very similar lighting to earlier in that scene. It was kind of soft lamp kind of glow.
Yeah.
And then he suggested that it would be better, the later scene would be better dark, like, because, it's more intimate when they're in the dark.
Yeah.
And so I was really impressed at how much you could do with post, like how much you could change the look of a scene.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Not lit at all.
Yeah, no, you're right. And what gets me is when you talk to filmmakers and they talk about shooting it flat or because to me, when I hear people saying they're shooting flat, and it looks, if you see it pre-post, it just looks so washed out to me. It just looks odd. But of course, I understand that the whole point of doing that is so you can grade it massively. But it always seemed a bit odd before I understand why people did that, because you can look at it, it just looks really strange. But it's hard. The thing is, it's always hard to sort of fathom is, and I've asked editors this loads of times actually, and directors, how, because the vision you have, say you want a particular scene, I don't know, to look a bit redder for argument's sake, or I don't know, add more contrast to it. And of course, the grader can do that, but there might be instances where it's not quite what you're looking for, and I suppose the point I'm trying to make is you could be going backwards and forwards, and how do you solve that without literally being over their shoulder? I mean, I don't know if you were over the shoulder or was it all done remotely. I don't quite know how you did it. But that must be a tough thing, because must be instances when it's not quite the vision that you want.
Yeah. And that's why I think I like being director, editor, writer, because I can take every bit and mold it to how I want to see it. With colouring, he would send it through, and he would usually send 3 options, and then we would kind of toss it up, and I would fit it in, and I think that I'm a reasonably easy person to work with, so I wasn't trying to tweak it too much, but yeah, having the options was fantastic, because we could, think about, with the Uji scene with the river, what do we want to make it look early in the evening, a little bit bluer? Do we want to make it warmer, which I think we went for a more warm kind of feeling.
Yeah.
It's meant to be quite a romantic scene. So you can do so much. It's similar with photography or painting or anything, how much you put into the colour palette. And I know some directors like Wes Anderson, right, are really famous for knowing the colour palette.
Yeah.
That's hashtag goals. I want to get there one day.
No, and it's funny because you mentioned him, because palette-wise, his films are brilliant. And they're very striking. And it kind of gets him back to thinking about Ridley Scott, because, as an example, let's be honest, Alien Covenant, it wasn't a great film, but he's a great world builder. And and you can take pretty much any scene in that, and pretty much most of his films, and it always looks gorgeous. He is great. He has an amazing eye. Yeah, I know he's got access to dozens of cameras and the greatest technology, but still, you still need to build that, and you still need to be the person that makes those decisions. But the difference between Wes Anderson and Ridley Scott is generally Wes Anderson makes good films, and unfortunately Ridley Scott, he's made a few turkeys, to be fair, and it's heartbreaking, because I see Blade Runner, I see Gladiator, I see Alien, which is still my favourite film of all time. And part of the reason for that is with Alien, you can take any scene, it looks amazing, and the story's brilliant and everything. And it's upsetting when you think that he could still make great films, but I don't quite know what it is, where it's just not clicking anymore. I don't know. Who knows? But it's interesting you say about the cinematography and how you can do that. So when you're making the film and you've done the writing, obviously you're about to shoot, is there any point where you just think, this isn't working, I need to cut this scene, or this bit of dialogue, it just isn't happening? Did that happen to you? And did you have to sort of adjust on the fly, as it were?
Definitely. And the great thing about how we shot was we shot on weekends, which meant there were generally quite a few weeks between shoots.
Yeah.
And that doesn't sound ideal, but what was good about it was I could edit, and then I could see what worked and what didn't. So there were reshoots. There were, I'm trying to think of a specific example. There was this horrible moment, Steve, where I realized we'd made a continuity mistake.
Oh.
Where the scene before, Hayato, William, was wearing a different shirt to the next scene. And then the scene after that, so 3 scenes in sequence, he was wearing the shirt from the shirt from the first scene. And, my heart dropped, and I was just like, oh, no.
Photoshop.
Oh, this is awful. But it worked out for the best, because actually I went back and I wrote another scene that slotted in between the first and the second, which gave the film a lot more breathing room. And then I moved that third scene somewhere else. And so, yeah, I'd had this kind of plan for how the story would go. But as we were shooting and as things arose, there were times where I moved things, and there were times where I added scenes because it was just going too fast.
Right.
One of the bits of feedback I got from my beta watchers, I suppose, was that the romantic curve from the beginning to where they first kissed was just too fast, and it was unrealistic. And then that scene at the end where she goes to his apartment and they talk and they're upset, but then they kind of make up, that didn't exist in the first cut of the film at all.
Oh, interesting, right.
And it wasn't until Hamish Downey, who's my producer and also the director of Matcha and Vanilla, it wasn't until he watched it and he said, you know, you're going to need to shoot another scene, I think.
Oh, God.
And I was like, no, but I knew he was right. And so I wrote that scene, and yeah, I wouldn't. It's one of my favorite scenes in his apartment.
And the fact that you do the editing, I mean, I don't want to say there's a huge leap from editing to doing the grading and so on and so forth, but I suppose what I'm trying to imply is that if you can do the editing, which obviously you can, you're an editor. Have you thought about doing the grading at any point? Because you could do the one because they match, don't they? They fit together really well. Is that something you considered?
Like, the technology is still something I have to get my head around. So the very beginning I was a photographer.
Yeah.
And so I edit my own photos in Lightroom, and I have a lot of control, and I know the technology with that. But somehow it doesn't translate into video, because you have to take care of so many different things. You have to be careful of skin tones, and there's all these tools that are very powerful, and I just don't know how to use them yet. So once I invest a bit more time into learning, then definitely, I think becoming a color grader as well would give me more control. But if I want to do more films in the future, which I do, there's going to have to be a point where I have a team, because, yeah, one person can't do everything, right? So,
no, absolutely. No, you're spot on. It's just, and when I've looked at when these people are doing the colour grading, and just on screen the options, and I mean, it's just mind-boggling how these people can grasp with it all. And to be frank, I'm looking at a scene and they might say, oh yeah, we've adjusted it slightly. I can't tell the difference because it's so well done, but obviously they have an eye for it. They've got high-end equipment. So I totally understand where you're coming from. So just, yeah, if you could just finally tell us a bit about Matcha and Vanilla, which I think you're actually acting in this as well, aren't you? As well as editing.
Oh, I was a very, very small cameo, but right. I'm the editor.
Yeah.
I was the editor of Matcha and Vanilla. So it's a love story as well. It's a love story between 2 women in Osaka, and it's a very romantic film because it's talking about a mature relationship. Mm-hmm. It's not a beginning relationship. It's a relationship that's had time to develop and grow and build. And then a devastating life event occurs. One of them gets very, very sick.
Yeah.
And she's actually got terminal cancer.
Yeah.
And then the film is how this couple deals with the fallout of that, and how their relationship weathers the ups and downs of that. So it's a deeply moving film, and it really plays into the fears of many a gay man and woman in Japan, because homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage, is still really not recognized here.
Right. Okay.
There are certificates that you can get in different prefectures in different cities, but if your partner goes into a hospital and their family doesn't know you exist, which happens quite frequently because there still is a little bit of a stigma.
Yeah.
Then what happens to the partner who can't visit them? They're shut out from any decision, and they're shut out from the last days of their beloved life. So it comes from a deeply personal place for Hamish.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of his heart that goes into the film. And the two actresses do such a stellar job. And he's worked with them before. So as well, the cinematography, which is done by Paul Leeming, who's another collaborator that Hamish has worked with before. He just does amazing stuff, and he color grades. Yeah, altogether, it's a heartbreaking film, but it's a beautiful film.